Okay, Trump is back and he's gearing up to come back, move back to the White House. Over the weekend, he demanded that Republican leaders in the Senate who are going to be in the majority. They're going to be in the majority in the Senate and in the House, but he demanded on Truth Social that they agree to allow recess appointments. That's what we're going to talk about. This would actually be a significant shift in power away from the Senate, which is interesting because Trump, upon his return to Washington, is going to be surrounded by supportive people. He's going to be basically have almost total support from his party, including the more traditional Republicans who have been kind of like the movers and shakers in the Senate. But he's kind of testing their commitment to him now, especially the first few nominations that he announced were pretty mainstream. I mean, Mike Huckabee and Marco Rubio. These are, mainstream Republicans with a lot of support in Congress and in the Senate. However, he started kind of going a little bit in a different direction with his Attorney General pick, Matt Gaetz, and Tulsi Gabbard, who was a big supporter of his on the campaign trail, but, she ran for president as a Democrat just a few years ago. So will people like that get through the Senate? Well, no president has fully tested a complete constitutional bypass of the Senate in staffing his administration. So let's take a step back. We usually need a president who puts people up for consideration in the Senate while he is forming his cabinet. So the appointments clause appears in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. And it says that the president shall nominate and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors and other public ministers, counsels, judges of the Supreme Court, and all of their officers in the United States whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for. So what happens here, what this means, is that the president has plenary power to nominate political appointees. The Appointments Clause also confers plenary power on the Senate to reject or confirm a nominee through its advice and consent provision. And so this is really a hallmark of the separation of powers provisions in the Constitution. What the framers wanted to do was to ensure accountability and preempt tyranny. So there was this interplay between the president and Congress and the Senate, right? So the president would nominate people he wants in his cabinet, and they would have to get confirmed in the Senate. So the Constitution empowers the president to appoint ambassadors, judges, and other officers of the United States subject to advice and consent of the Senate. Today, more than 1,000 senior positions in the federal government require Senate confirmation. And the framers viewed this division of authority as a way to promote good government through better qualified officials. They had to get through the president and the Senate, right? But the Senate wasn't conceived to continuously be in session. Remember back, 200, 250 years ago, it was hard to communicate in the 18th century. It was hard, transportation was hard back then. So that meant that weeks could go by before lawmakers could be reconvened, even for an emergency. So the founding fathers wanted to make sure the government was still staffed. And so the Constitution, therefore, allows the president to fill vacancies while the Senate is in recess. But those commissions would expire at the end of the next session of Congress, meaning a recess appointee can't just hold office longer than 2 years, the length of a congressional session. So Article 2, Section 2, Clause 3 says that the president shall have power to fill up the vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. This is what's known as the Recess Appointments Clause. And this authorizes the president to make these temporary appointments when the Senate is not in session. This was actually adopted by the original Constitutional Convention without dissent and without debate regarding the intent and scope of the terms. In fact, Alexander Hamilton writes very clearly in Federalist 67 about recess appointment power, and he says it's really nothing more than a supplement for the purpose of establishing an auxiliary method of appointment in cases in which the general method was inadequate. It's generally accepted that the clause was really just designed to enable the president to ensure that the operation of government would continue even during periods where the Senate was not in session, and therefore the Senate would be unable to perform its advice and consent functions. Now, in addition to fostering administrative continuity, presidents have really kind of tried to stretch this. They've exercised authority under the recess appointment clause for political purposes, really appointing officials who they knew might have difficulty securing Senate confirmation. Again, during the nation's early history, Congress would be off for months at a time. There were months-long breaks in Washington, D.C., and the president could use recess appointments to avoid having an important job go unfilled. But presidents really tended to make recess appointments when the Senate was adjourned for lengthy periods, and since World War II, presidents have sometimes made recess appointments even really where Senate opposition appeared strong, and the presidents hoped that the appointees would kind of prove themselves in office in the interim and then allow the opposition to dissipate. More recently, however, we all know that partisanship on Capitol Hill has really grown, and as a result of that, recess appointments have really tended to solidify opposition to the appointee. But more recently, the process of recess appointments has been featured in partisan fights with the president. Let's go back to Bill Clinton. When he was president, he made 139 recess appointments. Then President George W. Bush made 171. But neither of them used the process for top-level cabinet positions. Then President Obama tried to continue this practice. He used it 32 times, but this actually ended up at the Supreme Court in 2014, and the Supreme Court put a check on the president's power to make recess appointments. Really interesting case. This was the case of the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, versus Noel Canning. And the Supreme Court ultimately adopted a relatively broad interpretation of the clause. With respect to the meaning of the phrase recess of the Senate, what does that mean? Well, the court concluded that the phrase applied to two types of recesses. Intersession recesses, right, where the Senate literally is between sessions. They're on holiday vacation, right? They're on break. Or intra-session recesses. They take a break within their scheduled, set time that they should be meeting. So in so holding, the court said, you know what, the text of the Constitution is ambiguous. And the court said we really have to rely on a pragmatic interpretation of the clause that would allow the president to ensure the continued functioning of the federal government when the Senate is away, the way that Hamilton kind of envisioned it in the Federalist Papers. And the court said there's a long settled and established historical practice of the president making even intra-session recess appointments. However, the court declined to say how long a recess must be to fall within this clause. Instead, it held that the historical practice counseled that a recess of more than 3 days but less than 10 is really presumptively too short to trigger the president's appointment power under the clause, and that's what did it in for President Obama. With respect to the phrase may happen, the majority found this ambiguity in the text and said that the clause applied both to vacancies that first come into existence during a recess, but also theoretically to vacancies that initially occur before a recess but continue to exist after the Senate goes on recess. And in so holding, again, the court was basically being pragmatic. They said, not only does this ensure the functioning of the continuous functioning of the government, but also historically, this is the precedent. This is what was done. Interestingly, though, even under a broad interpretation of the recess appointments clause, the Senate may limit the ability to make recess appointments by exercising its procedural prerogatives. The court in the Canning decision held that for the purposes of the recess appointments clause, the Senate is in session when the Senate says that it is in session, and the Senate gets to play by its own rules. In other words, it retains the capacity to transact Senate business. So the Canning decision gave the Senate really the means to prevent recess appointments by a president who attempts to employ this method of appointing officers to the United States using the recess appointments clause by basically saying, listen, we, the Senate, are not on vacation. And so the court said, the Senate really was in session when President Obama tried to pretend it wasn't in session. It said it was in session, and under the Senate rules, it retained the power to conduct business. And because the Senate was in session, President Obama made the recess appointments at issue during only a 3-day recess. And again, the Senate said, this is not a bona fide recess, we're still in session. And the court said that was just too short a time to fall within the scope of the clause, so the president lacked the ability to make those appointments. Fast forward to Trump now, Trump's first term, while he was president in 2020, Trump threatened to use the recess appointments really after the Democrats had slowed the Senate from confirming his nominees. He got upset and threatened to use a presidential power in the Constitution to adjourn both chambers of Congress, what he considered to be extraordinary occasions when there is a disagreement between the House and Senate on adjourning. Now, the Constitution does in fact give the president limited authority to make appointments when Congress is not in session, and it also actually gives the president the power to adjourn the House and Senate, although no president has ever done so in order to staff an administration. But if you look at Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, it says clearly that in the case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment, the president may adjourn them to such time as he think proper. Meaning the president could theoretically exercise his power to adjourn both chambers of Congress if one chamber votes to take a recess and the other does not. So Trump threatened to adjourn Congress to make appointments toward the end of his first term. And now, where he's coming out, people are fearing that he'll actually follow through with this as he begins his second term. He's already called for the Senate to let him make these recess appointments in order that the other side, the Democrats, won't be able to slow down his confirmation process. So while no president has done this before, there is this Supreme Court precedent that this power does in fact exist. Going back to the NLRB versus Canning decision, the court said, quote, the Constitution gives the president a way to force a recess. So to allow Trump to make the appointments, Republican senators would have to pass a motion of adjournment, and that would only take a simple majority vote. Although the Democrats would likely do everything in their power to, prevent this from happening, and it's not clear if such a move would be fully supported even by all of the Republican senators. So everybody wants to know, would these recess appointments work? Well, the first thing we know on the ground is that the new Senate Majority Leader, John Cornyn, originally suggested that he may be open to allowing Trump to make these recess appointments, but more recently, after these interesting picks for Attorney General and other interesting picks, he said, obviously, I don't think we should be circumventing the Senate's responsibilities, but I think it's premature to be talking about recess appointments right now. So he's kind of towing an interesting thin line. There are very few, though, if any, Republicans that are openly willing to defy President Trump. So what would happen if he actually tries to go through with this? Well, the scheme would almost immediately find its way in the courts. And, the courts would need to address a constitutional provision that has been effectively silent for over 200 years. The only word that we really have is Justice Breyer's opinion in the Canning decision, but the Supreme Court's newer members, especially the newer conservative members, may not agree with that opinion because in the NLRB versus Canning decision, there was a concurrence by Justice Scalia. And it was joined by Chief Justice John Roberts and Justices Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. And they all agreed with the conclusion of the majority, but they argued in the concurrence that the president's recess appointment power is actually far more limited than the court's current interpretation. So, if this would go to the Supreme Court today or tomorrow, the conservative justices could use the case to really limit the recess appointment power to only apply when a vacancy opens up during a recess, not when one is already there and then, Senate is in session and then the president says, I want the Senate to go away. There is a former constitutional law professor who is currently in Congress, and that's Representative Jamie Raskin. He is a Democrat. He's from Maryland. He said that this was an open constitutional question, whether recess appointments made possible by convening and adjourning Congress just for that purpose alone would be legitimate. He says that does look like a, quote, defeat of the constitutional design, but ultimately he acknowledged that if it were challenged, let's say by the Senate Democrats, that it would go to the Supreme Court, and John Roberts' Supreme Court has been pretty pro-Trump recently, at least in the interim, right? Things take time. The court has to hear arguments and deliberate. In the meantime, Trump's recess picks would actually enjoy the same powers as full-blown cabinet officials, officers who were confirmed by the Senate. There was a 2015 Congressional Research Service report that said clearly, quote, a confirmed appointee and a recess appointee have the same legal authority and receive the same rate of pay.